As Americans, we proudly tout our heritage as a nation of immigrants, a melting pot, we like to say. But when it comes to new arrivals, is there simply not enough room left in the pot for any more immigrants to melt into? That and much more on this week's immigration-themed episode of The Point. Stick around. Welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian, and we have an excellent show ahead for you guys today. A recent report indicates that as many as 11.7 million undocumented immigrants are currently living in the United States. Considering Obama received more than 75% of the Latino vote during the re-election campaign, it isn't surprising that he's in the spotlight for comprehensive immigration reform. Right now, we're dealing with undocumented immigrants by tossing them in private prisons, which costs American taxpayers $2 billion just last year alone. And the government plans for new facilities to house the 400,000 immigrants detained annually. So what's the right solution? Today we're going to talk about some major issues related to immigration in the U.S. We'll discuss the history and economics of immigration before finally concluding the show with the topic of assimilation and the expectations that first-generation immigrants face today. But of course, I can't have that conversation on my own, so let's talk to our panelists and our fantastic experts on this topic of immigration. First, we have Axel Caballero. He is the founder and director of Cuéntame, a nonprofit campaigning media organization for the Latino community. Axel is also part of the Brave New Foundation team and runs the Spanish language blog metaforapolitica.com. Axel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've done some work with TYT in the past, so
yes.
Seems like you keep coming back.
Well, thank you. I guess something's working.
Yeah, by the way, Jenk and I love your last name. We love to say Caballero. It's a really good last name. So, all right. We also have Ahilan Arulanantham. He is the Deputy Legal Director for the ACLU of Southern California. He's also the Senior Staff Attorney for the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, we have Wendy Carrillo. She is the host and executive producer of Knowledge is Power, a radio show on KPWR Los Angeles, Power 106, that mixes politics, pop culture, hip-hop, and community activism. Wendy, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I love Power 106. I grew up listening to it. So.
Thank you. Keep listening.
Yes. All right. Well, but let's get to the very first topic when it comes to immigration. I think that it's obviously a very hot button topic right now. A lot of people are talking about it, a lot of debates about it, but oftentimes we tend to forget about the history of immigration in this country. And to kind of share a little more information about that, we have Immortal Technique. Watch.
Peace, what's going on? This is Immortal Technique, and my point is on immigration. I think that there has been a vicious mischaracterization of people of indigenous background in this country, people who helped build this nation, individuals who had their land stolen from them. And I think that if we're basing the legitimacy of our conquest of the Southwest on the fact that we won a war and then took a bunch of people's land, then what's to stop someone someday from saying, hey, we're going to carve a piece out of America, and if we can win a few victories, then we can call every red-blooded American here an illegal human being. I think that there needs to be a lot more understanding of what actually is legal and what's not legal, and who made things legal and not legal. I think a little humility is in order. I think that we've always counted and been very, very adamant about talking about what immigrants have taken from this country, as opposed to what they've given and what they continue to give. This country was built by immigrants. It'll continue to be built by immigrants. And if it wasn't, then none of this would be here. And remember that anytime you're in New York City, no matter what kind of food they're serving, it's a Mexican restaurant, homie, all right? Immortal Technique, I'm out of here. That was my very, very brief point. Hit me at Immortal Tech on Twitter. We could discuss immigration, we could discuss Syria, we can discuss gun control, we can talk about it all. I'm open to have those conversations. I love y'all out there. Be good to one another. Peace.
Not only is Immortal Technique probably one of the most smartest rappers, but he is also one of the few rappers who's actually demanding a little more humility, which I like. Now, Axel, I want to start off with you. Do you think most Americans realize how the United States got California, Arizona, New Mexico? Do they know the history of those states?
I really don't think so. I think, or at least in some cases, they don't want to know, really. I mean, we have a very curated version of history here in the United States particularly, we tend to think that we came together as a whole just magically to a certain extent, that the history is not of communities coming together, that is the ingrained fact or the base of the US, that it is a nation of immigrants. And for example, with Mexico, I mean, it's not that long ago that the Treaty of Hidalgo was signed that acquired particularly California, Texas, and some portions of Nevada and Utah and stuff. That particular item that we don't really discuss about gives us a link back to Mexico. We have more stuff in common than we have apart. And when we talk about humanity and humility, I think that needs to be kind of remembered.
Yeah. That's really interesting, you know, especially when you consider that we have an entire holiday that celebrates, you know, Europeans coming to this country and so-called founding this country. But you don't really think about what we have done to the natives, you know, and how the native population went through untold torture because of, you know, Europeans coming here and settling in this country. Now, Wendy, what do you think about what Immortal Technique was saying about the history of the United States, and why is it that we're so schizophrenic when it comes to our immigration policy?
I think a lot of it is because we just don't know the history of this country. So I was raised in LA. Did you know that the California Constitution is in Spanish? Most people don't know that. The first time that I went to the East Coast, I was amazed by the monuments, the history. You go to see the Bell, you go see the White House, you go to the Washington Monument, you see all these things, but you don't see those things in the Southwest. You don't see them aside from like the Alamo, I think, in Texas. Like, there's no history that ties us to something that we could visually see. And I think that's really important and critical, because that reminds us of where we come from and, you know, what we've done, and the line that was created. You know, you had people that lived in, you know, Southern California, that because of a border, all of a sudden your cousins are Native American,
right?
But you're not, because you're on the other side of the border. So when did that happen, and how do we correct that? That's something that we need to address when we talk about indigenous versus Native American. Sometimes they're the same.
So in terms of, you know, the history of the Southwest and, you know, the lack of monuments that tell individuals about our history, why do you feel that there is a lack of history? Well, not a lack of history, but a lack of transparency, knowledge when it comes to our history. Do you feel that it's something that's being hidden, or is it just that people just don't really care, they don't want to know, and it's not something they're pushing for?
Yeah, I think it's because it's a combination of a lot of things that you mentioned. So, you know, history books is written by those in power. So if those in power don't want us to know that history, then we're not going to know that history. Right now we have bills in Arizona that banned Dolores Huerta. Like, she's alive still, and you can't teach about what she's done with the farm workers, or they want to ban ethnic studies. I mean, that would not happen to any other community other than the Latino community and how we're seeing it now. There's no way that you can go to the black community and say, you know what, we no longer want to teach about Martin Luther King. There would be outrage for that. So we need to see what's happening across the country.
You raise a really good point about the most powerful individuals making decisions as to what ends up in our books, in our textbooks particularly. There was a really incredible story about how textbook manufacturers in Texas were being told by lawmakers, by Republican lawmakers, conservative lawmakers, that maybe it's a good idea to get rid of people like Cesar Chavez and include more right-wing, anti-civil rights leaders, so we can, you know, have so-called balance in the school systems. But, you know, I know that the ACLU did a lot of work to help prevent that. You know, what other actions is the ACLU taking to make sure that people remain informed about this country's history and immigration?
Right, I mean, the protection of academic freedom around the subject of immigration is incredibly important, and we've seen that fight happen in Texas and Arizona extensively. You know, I think the history more broadly tells us that slogan, "No human being is illegal," it contains a very basic truth, right? The idea that what we're talking about here are porous borders that were contingent and that were changed and they're a product of history, whereas the people who are harmed by them are real people with real families and whose lives are really torn apart if they're deported and, you know, sent away from the place that's the only place that they've ever known. And I think if we take that understanding seriously, then it means that we have to have a more humane immigration policy. And I hope that's something that we see that comes out of this debate, is to recognize the harshness of deportation and immigration detention as well, you know.
So go ahead, Axel.
And it comes to show you how politics have permeated this whole debate, how really it's immigration reform now, as we talk about, is about a politician's game. Everyone wants to have their face in front of whatever reform we're talking about. It's really interests, it's really groups that are entrenched within our political system, and we forget, rightly mentioned here, we forget the humanity, the human aspect of it, the personal stories that need to be told in order to push forth this item, this notion that immigrants are more than a political football.
Yes, now they definitely have been a political football. We keep seeing politicians, Obama included, saying that they are going to somehow pass some sort of comprehensive immigration reform, but this happens every few years and nothing really gets done. And the reason why nothing gets done is, of course, it is used as a political football, but at the same time, this is a very complicated issue. But, you know, just to play devil's advocate with you guys a little bit, you know, there is obviously a huge difference between immigrants, people who came to this country legally. They went through the insanely long process of becoming legal immigrants, and people who cross the border illegally and, you know, they just kind of live this underground life, and it's not an easy life to live, but they've obviously they've broken the law. So Axel, what do you propose that we do with those individuals?
Well, the first thing that we have to identify is why this legal system that has been put in place and why it's affecting the migration flows. I think if we don't go backwards, if we don't go at the root of the situation of how migration comes to this country, of why it does, of what makes immigrants come here, we're never going to really address the issue of like whether we need to legalize or not. The first aspect is to really understand what the intrinsic and basic rights of individuals are when they come to this country and base whatever reform on that notion. If we take the criminality aside, if we take this whole notion of illegal or legal, we can have a better understanding, a better debate. And I think that that's more important. And you mentioned it, the line is really long. It's really, really long. So obviously there is a push for folks who want to come to not stand in line.
Yeah.
And so that's a first, you know, notion to kind of consider.
I think it's also important to recognize the distinction you draw at the beginning, the legal immigrants who wait in line and then the ones who cross the border. The law is much more complex than that. You know, it doesn't have that simple binary for you. I mean, many people who come here illegally, as in crossing the border and not getting admitted, have a right to stay here, either because they apply for asylum, because they're fleeing persecution from their country. You know, many people from Central America obviously suffered through the wars in the 80s and before, and came here and have a right to live in this country, even though they crossed the border. You know, and then you've got people who overstay their visas. They come on a visa, but actually it's a huge percentage of the people who are not authorized to stay here are people who came here, who came here and then overstayed their visa. So this sort of line like, oh, the bad people crossing the border and the good people who, you know, get their paper, it doesn't really accord with the reality of what we see.
Right, and I don't like characterizing them as good versus bad. I mean, obviously everyone who's coming to this country are coming here for a better opportunity, and you can't blame those people. I mean, we give amnesty to certain individuals, but others who are dealing with, you know, terrible living conditions, for some reason, don't get that same amnesty. So we keep picking winners and losers, and I don't think that that's the right way to handle the situation either. Now, I want to share your personal stories a little bit more because I think that that's really fascinating. Wendy, you actually came here from El Salvador, and you went through trials and tribulations when it came to becoming a citizen.
That's right. So I grew up during the Civil War in El Salvador, and so a lot of the questions that we got to ask is, why do people come to the United States to begin with? Well, my family was faced with either you are potentially going to die in the Civil War or you look for other alternatives. And one of the alternatives was to leave the country, and my mother decided to come to the United States and start a new life. And so she came before I did, saved money, and then brought me and my grandmother and my aunt over. I came undocumented. I didn't even know that until I was 13 when, you know, we went back to El Salvador, and then I had to come back, and, you know, that was our end of the line moment, and re-enter the country, and then became a naturalized citizen. But I think that raises a very important question that a lot of people ask, or the commentary is, well, why don't they just go back to their country? One, it's a country that a lot of people have never known. I didn't, as a 13-year-old girl who was listening to Madonna and wearing alley gears, like, I didn't know anything about living in El Salvador. And then the question is, well, why do they come to begin with? Well, a lot of it has to do with American foreign policy, which is missing in the large conversation of immigration reform. So,
and what would you specifically refer to when it comes to U.S. foreign policy?
well, let's look at NAFTA. Let's look at, you know, the militarization of, you know, other governments by the American government. And so there's a lot of complicated nuances. You know, in Mexico, a lot of the farmers can no longer afford to crop in their own lands because of the American importation of certain goods. So you have tomato fields that are going, that are being like just simply rotting because no farmers can crop that land. And so we got to look at how we as the American government impact our Latin American neighbors to begin with.
Yeah, the war on drugs is another perfect example of that. I mean, we keep fueling this war on drugs, which empowers the cartels. And can you really blame, you know, Mexicans for wanting to come across the border to the United States? Axel, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, you can consider me as a NAFTA baby, because really, that's I always
NAFTA baby.
The NAFTA. That's I guess we can coin that.
NAFTA, okay.
But I'm a cross-border child. I was born and raised in Sonora, and Arizona was the border state, and I always went back and forth. It was natural. It was easy. It was just going back and forth. At around 16 or 17, I permanently moved to Arizona, and my father was a citizen. But the laws at that time, if you if you were 18 years old by that time, you didn't qualify immediately. And so therefore you had to go through the process. And my family, like many families out there, was stuck, particularly because a person that was helping with our immigration case defrauded a lot of people. Like
yeah,
300,
and that
400.
happens often.
It happens all the time. And I'm sure you guys have an amazing amount of cases. And luckily for me, we realized this, at a good time, and we acted, and I acted upon it, and it was a positive outcome per se. But many families don't have the same outcome. They don't really know their status because they feel or they think that it's being handled, and then suddenly, they get the knock on the door, and they don't know that they're undocumented.
Yeah.
They don't know that their process has expired.
It's incredible. All right, unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment. We didn't even get to touch on the DREAM Act, but I just want to make a quick comment about that. Obama proposed the DREAM Act, Congress denied the DREAM Act, and I think that it's the most common sense piece of legislation that Congress can pass. You have young individuals being smuggled into the country. The only thing that they know is the United States. They go to school, they get admitted into a college, or they join the military, and you don't want to grant them citizenship. It doesn't make any sense at all. But anyway, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the economics of immigration. And you know what? It's not as simple as some might think. Welcome back to The Point. Our next point is on the economical impact of immigration. And of course, a lot of people are under the assumption that if we have undocumented immigrants here in the United States, then they must be sucking our economy dry, and it's a huge financial issue. But the problem is a little more complicated than that. And we have Professor Ben Powell to give us some pointers on what the reality is. Let's take a look.
I'm Ben Powell, a professor of economics at Suffolk University, and I want to explode 3 popular myths about immigration. Immigration is a contentious issue, but unfortunately, a lot of the public debate is centered on the wrong things. These 3 myths are that immigrants are a net drag on our economy, that they steal our jobs, and that they depress our wages. None of these are true. Immigrants are a net benefit to the economy. Economists who study immigration, even economists who are otherwise critical of immigration, are in almost universal agreement of this. They don't think the net economic benefit's huge, but all agree that it's positive. The next myth is that they steal our jobs. There's absolutely no evidence for this. This is a fallacy of the seen and the unseen. When an immigrant comes in, it's obvious when we see an American worker who loses his job. But what we don't see is that another job is created for that American. That's why, over time, we don't find a net increase in unemployment as immigrants come in. Think about what's happened to the workforce in the last 60 years. Massive entry of baby boomers, women, and immigrants into the workforce. But yet, no increase in long-term unemployment. You still have business cycles and fluctuations in unemployment, but no long-term increase. Instead, we see as the labor force increases, so does total employment. That brings us to wages. So we add more workers to the workforce. Mustn't that depress U.S. wages? Again, we don't find much evidence for this. In fact, the only wage depression that economists find is when you look at just people without a high school diploma in the United States, and even there, the negative effect on their wages is very small. And the reason is, immigrant labor is different than the domestic labor. They bring a different skill set. So often immigrants who come are either very highly skilled or very low skilled. A lot of US labor is somewhere in the middle, moderately skilled, but very few of us are at the top of the pyramid and very few of us are at the bottom. The result is, when immigrants come, they largely complement our talents. They don't substitute for us. It frees American labor to do things that American labor is better suited to do. As a result, we become more productive and they become more productive. Whatever your position was on immigration before, if one of these three myths was holding you back, it should push you more on the margin to wanting more open borders, not less.
Now, Powell's video was definitely interesting, but it did lack some nuance, and I'm hoping that we can really delve into that in this discussion. And another thing that I do want to mention that I found interesting is he mentioned immigration, but he did not mention specifically illegal immigration. So there was a little bit, there was a lack of clarity on that. So just to tell you guys what the flaws were in that video before we actually start this discussion. Now, let's actually have the discussion. Now, Ahilan, I want to start off with you. What are your thoughts about his claims about the economic impact of immigrants? You know, a lot of Americans will say, you know, forget this whole comprehensive immigration reform. Let's just get rid of all 11.7 million immigrants and just do away with them. But is the problem more complicated than that?
Well, yes. For one thing, that's impossible, right? Mm-hmm. And even in the course of the presidential election, you know, even Mitt Romney's idea was we should self-deport, you know, encourage people to leave on their own, because we recognize you can't deport 11.7 million people. The court costs involved, the detention costs involved is staggering. It would be a huge waste of our resources, you know, not to mention the massive humanitarian impact that such a policy would involve. And I think the interesting thing about what Professor Powell says is the sort of myth about the effect on economics persists, even though the empirical evidence on it is overwhelmingly one-sided. I mean, we consistently see study after study that doesn't, you know, come from any particular ideology or any particular spectrum. It shows that immigration is good for the economy as a whole.
Ahilan, I like that you said that. I like that Powell said that, especially because we do have the hard data in front of us right now, and I think that it's important that we share that with the audience so they don't think that this is just some sort of propaganda that we're trying to spew out there. There is actual evidence, and a lot of it comes from the Congressional Budget Office. So the IRS estimates that about 6 million unauthorized immigrants file individual income tax returns each year. Okay, between 50% and 75% of unauthorized immigrants pay federal, state, and local taxes. And of course, this is from the Congressional Budget Office. Illegal immigrants are estimated to pay about $7 billion per year into Social Security. And by the way, even though they spend or they pay $7 billion per year, they are not eligible to get those benefits once they retire. So they're paying into the system, but they don't reap the benefits. And also, their Social Security and Medicare contributions directly support older Americans, as illegal immigrants are not eligible to receive these services. So this is all information that exists. These studies are done. Why is it that this information is not being pumped out to the masses so they understand what the positive impact of immigration is, even if it is undocumented immigration? You
know, one other footnote I want to add to the numbers that you gave, the immigration enforcement cost is massive. Right? And actually, yeah, $18 billion, and the Immigration Customs Enforcement as an agency spends more on enforcement than the FBI, the DEA, the alcohol, tobacco, firearms, all of the other federal enforcement agencies combined. And that is a striking, when we talk about a time when we're trying to shrink the government and lessen wasteful spending, immigration enforcement is a massive, massive waste of resources in that respect.
You know, as I mentioned earlier in the intro of this show, I said that we are spending $2 billion on detaining these undocumented immigrants each year, $2 billion. And I know that if you consider the entire federal budget, that's a drop in the bucket, right? But if you're really going to talk about saving money and the economy, the way we're handling immigration right now is not the right way to handle it. Now, that's not to say that we open our borders and we just let everyone in. I think, of course, that's the wrong way to handle it. But Axel, what do you think?
Well, first we have to consider also, and by the way, we're planning, the immigration reform proposal plans to increase the budget for the next cycle for enforcement particularly, which is absolutely absurd. That's the first priority that we put forth, is to add money to enforcement, to continue this punitive approach, to really continue the massive deportations and the raids and the separation of families. And what we really need to focus is first and foremost on considering the rights of individuals, because that's the basic nature of immigration, is that they're individuals who want to come for a better life, and they're contributing not only, as we mentioned, to the economy. Undocumented immigrants paid more taxes than General Electric, as a whole.
That's a great point.
It's the reality of what immigration is to this country, and so we have to understand it from that perspective. If we continue getting lost in these numbers, in the numbers game of what it means, we continue to lose what the real focus is, which is people. Immigration is about people, and that's how we need to begin this discussion.
Now, one thing that we're obviously seeing is that some farmers, not all of them, I don't want to make a blanket statement, are taking advantage of undocumented immigrants by not even paying them minimum wage. They're paying them less than that. And so a lot of opponents of undocumented immigrants will say, well, we got to get rid of them, because if we don't, they're going to continue to keep the wages extremely low, and then Americans won't get to work those jobs. Of course, the farmers are going to be more likely to hire the undocumented immigrants. Wendy, what is your answer to that question, or to that statement?
Actually, it's funny because I went to go see Carlos Mencia, who's a comedian, some time ago, and he made a joke about how African Americans, there was no way that they're going to go pick cotton anymore. So guess who's going to do it? It's going to be immigrants, it's going to be Latinos. And I'm not saying it funny, he was much funnier than I am, obviously. But it made me really think about, who are these Americans that want these jobs? Because I don't see a line in the Central Valley of people that want to go pick grapes or pick lettuce. So who are these Americans that immigrants are taking away their jobs? And you asked earlier, why don't we know the stats? Stats aren't sexy. Nobody wants to talk numbers. It doesn't bring ratings to any shows. Like,
maybe I should have told them in a bikini. I don't know.
Maybe. But there's a big contribution that undocumented immigrants and immigrants in general contribute to the country. And we are looking at a time right now, too. You mentioned the elderly. For the first time in our nation's history, we're going to see what's being called the silver tsunami. We have the baby boomers who are in their 80s, and their kids who are becoming senior citizens as well. The American Latino community, on average, I think I saw a census report, is 24 years old. So the Latino community is the one that's going to eventually support all these senior citizens who rely on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all these things that you talk about. So why aren't we talking about the numbers? It's just, it's not sexy. Nobody wants to know the truth.
Well, the one argument that opponents would go back to is the fact that farmers are unwilling to pay Americans a fair wage for the back-breaking labor that they'd have to do on the farms. And Axel, what is your response to that?
Well, that's particularly a good point, because if it was the economics, then slavery will still be here. And that's the reality. I mean, the fact that we give a blank pass to big agro and to these big industries to abuse and exploit farm workers, Latino farm workers and immigrant farm workers, is completely wrong. There has to be something wrong with our food chain. There has to be with our food supply, that we consider these approaches right, that we consider this as the institutionalized version of what the economy is. And so we need to also, this is a whole part of immigration. We need to consider what that is doing at the human level, and to who is impacting, and the social and human cost that it has to communities as a whole. And I think that that's a really good point.
Yeah, I just think one important benefit that would come from legalization of the 11.7 million people that we've been talking about, it would mean that those people would then have the ability to get the protections that our law affords to all kinds of people, that should be afforded to everyone. So workplace protections, protections for people who are farm workers who may suffer the harms of pesticides and inadequate wages and meal breaks and rest breaks and all these things. I mean, these are all protections that people can't take take for themselves because they're scared, because they're undocumented.
One thing that comes to mind as you mentioned that is the Violence Against Women Act, and how Republicans, basically do not want to renew the Violence Against Women Act because of the fact that it would extend protections to Native Americans, gay individuals, and also undocumented immigrants. So it's basically saying that undocumented immigrants aren't as human as people who are in this country legally, which is a ridiculous way to handle anything. Of course they're human. Of course they deserve equal protections. And one protection that you mentioned during the break, Ahilan, was the right to an attorney if they are facing deportation. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yes, it's a little known and really important protection, and it's really a national disgrace in my view. You can have a lawyer in a deportation case if you can pay for one, but you do not have a right to an appointed lawyer. And this is a protection that we extended into the criminal realm in the 1960s, so that a person, say, charged with a theft or a robbery or something like that, if they're facing even 1 day in prison as a result of that sentence, they get an appointed lawyer if they can't afford one. But on the immigration side, we have people facing permanent banishment from this country, separation from their families, the only places they've known since they were children, or separation from their own wives or husbands and children. And if they can't afford a lawyer, then they are supposed to defend themselves in immigration court. And this is true even if they're put in immigration prisons while their case is pending, which happens for thousands of people. About 30,000 people every day are in immigration prisons. Many of them are not undocumented. Many of them are lawful permanent residents who the government is trying to deport because of a criminal conviction. They had a lawyer in their criminal case, but now in their immigration case, they don't have one.
And of course the common misconception is, well, these people are undocumented and they haven't paid into the system, so they don't deserve these protections. And as I pointed out earlier, in many cases they do pay taxes. In fact, they pay for goods and services that they'll never even get to take advantage of.
If I could add something to that.
Go ahead.
For people that say comments like that, well, they don't deserve it. They came here illegally. They should just leave, whatever. They don't deserve the protections. We have to ask ourselves, is that the kind of country that we want? Do we want the United States to be a country that doesn't offer these benefits to everyone? Because that's how we pride ourselves to be. We're the country of value and families, and we go to different nations across the globe and portray our democracy, yet internally here at home, we don't do the same.
Well, there's nothing like a family values Republican who wants to separate, immigrant families and deport their parents while the children stay here in the United States.
And foster care, and that's a whole other issue as well, as to all these kids that are growing up without their parents in the system.
And Democrats, not just Republicans. Right?
Yeah, Democrats
President Obama
as well.
has deported more people, 400,000 people, more than George W. Bush ever did. I mean, it's a real disgrace.
And we've brought these workers here. I mean, our policies have brought these workers here. If you go back to NAFTA, there's this anecdote where they were negotiating. Everything was on the table. Canadians said, no, really, timber's not on the table. Mexicans said, no, really, oil's not on the table. And the US said, no, labor's not on the table. And that is really, the background of what NAFTA is and what it has influenced in particular places like Mexico, and why it keeps pulling people over here, particularly to do this type of work.
All right, we got to take a quick break, but when we come back, my favorite topic when it comes to immigration, assimilation, something that all of us went through when we, I was born here in the United States, so was Ahilan, but we all had to deal with Americanizing ourselves, and was that the right way to go about it? Stay tuned. Welcome back to the last segment of The Point. Before we get to assimilation, I wanted to make a few points about the last segment we discussed. Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes to talk about these very big topics, but I wanted to mention Alabama and Georgia. Both states had these very, very tough laws that prevented farmers from employing undocumented immigrants, and this happened last year, and as a result they lost the majority of their workers, and they tried to get Americans to work on their farms, but it didn't happen. Americans were not interested in working on their farms, and they had to petition to the federal government to basically change the law and get a little bit of help because they were in a lot of trouble. Another thing I wanted to mention was that between 2000 and 2007 we saw a huge boom in Latin Americans immigrating here to the United States, and a lot of it has to do with supply and demand. Of course, the housing market was on the up and up. We know what happened in 2008, but as a result we needed more construction workers, so more immigrants came here in the United States to fill those jobs. But also keep in mind that after 2008 more and more undocumented immigrants actually went back to Mexico. In fact, in recent years, we've seen a net loss when it comes to undocumented immigrants from Mexico. So those are all important and interesting statistics to keep in mind. And with that said, let's talk about assimilation. So assimilation has to do with, you know, kind of blending into American culture, not necessarily letting go of your, you know, your native culture, but also learning to be more Americanized. Now, understandably, this is a very touchy topic, and it's something that comedian Bill Santiago talks about in the next video. Let's take a look.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bill Santiago. I'm a comedian and I'm an author, and I'm here to talk about assimilation, to make a point, further point about assimilation, which I have a very negative reaction to, because I've always heard the word in an assimilate or else context. And I don't understand why you would submit yourself to that, or why anybody would ask you to do that as a condition for being a fully vested American. You know, you're coming from another country, you have a wonderful, rich experience, and why wouldn't you want to hold on to that? And yet, they ask you virtually to commit a cultural lobotomy on yourself in order to be accepted as a member of this country. And I think that's such a shame. I don't think people know what they're asking you to give up, to wipe out of your bloodstream. Future generations, obviously, they just slip right into the mainstream culture because there's no slipping to be done. They are a part of it. They are born into it. So obviously, assimilation isn't even a question. It's a moot point in the future generations. So I don't see what all the quibbling is about in reference to the people who are just getting here. It's their children, and in their case, the most difficult challenge is holding on to the culture that you came from. You don't want to lose that. You know, that's where you come from. That's sort of inducing an unnecessary amnesia. And it's a tragedy. It's a shame not to be able to benefit from that when it was so recently a palpable part of your consciousness. It's there. It's there. Don't lose it. Resistance is not futile. That's my point.
What a great point. And I think that a lot of people have a different perception of what assimilation means. I mean, he mentioned cultural lobotomy, which I think is a really fascinating phrase. For me, assimilation is acquiring elements of both cultures and living with it and owning it. But Wendy, what does assimilation mean to you? And do you have as much of a negative reaction to it as Santiago did?
I think I have more of a comedic reaction to it because, so I'm Salvadorian. I grew up in East Los Angeles around Mexicans. I was like the only Salvadorian in my block. So I had to assimilate to Mexican culture, then I had to assimilate to American social culture. I wanted to have a quinceañera and wanted to convince my mom to let me go to prom. So there was like all these different things, and my parents had to assimilate to what it was like to be parents of kids going to an American high school. So there's all kinds of stuff that's going on there. I put tapatio on everything that I eat. Okay,
I'm Armenian and I do that too.
I went to Mexico City during the bicentennial because I never been to Mexico before. I asked the waiter for tapatio and he was like, "What is that?" And I was like, "You're crazy. What do you mean, what is that?" Apparently it's only like a Mexican American thing. But now there's like counter assimilation. You have white folks that gotta learn how to assimilate into Latino culture too, you know, and there's like novelas and like all kinds of music, fun stuff. So I think it's funny. It's a funny situation. You gotta look at it through a lens of like, you either laugh or you're gonna like kill yourself like our friend.
Do you think the majority of white Americans are in favor of this reverse assimilation, or do you feel like there's some hostility toward it?
I think it depends. You know, they want to learn Spanish. They watch novelas. You know, they want to know. They just need to be invited into the culture. They need to feel like it's okay. That it doesn't mean that Latinos are taking over. It just means that we're a large part of the American identity now, and it's okay to like tapatio if you're Armenian. Like it's okay to watch novelas and learn Spanish. It's okay to want to have a quinceañera even though you're not Latina. Like that's the new Sweet 16. You know, it's all these things that I think make living here such an incredible place. In Los Angeles, you could go anywhere in the world without leaving.
I put chili powder on my watermelon yesterday. Like that's as Angelino as you can get, right?
Exactly.
But Axel, why don't you jump in? Let's talk about language a little bit, because I'm curious about that as well. Growing up, I mean, I had two parents who, by the way, are from Armenia. I'm first generation, and they would always tell me, like, no English in the house. You've got to speak Armenian to us. Armenian, Armenian, Armenian. And there was resistance toward that. Now I kind of regret it because my Armenian is, you know, subpar. Well, did you experience any of that, Axel?
Well, basically a little bit. At the beginning, you know, it's always like learn the language of, you know, where you are. But then also it's like, oh, don't forget your roots. You know, my grandma particularly was like, oh, remember where you're coming from and stuff. And they would always say it back and time again. But I think, you know, part of that question is when we're assimilating to what, really? I mean, what is it that people consider American? You know, and I think that that's the intrinsic question, really. Which is this multicultural nation. We are a multicultural nation of immigrants. That's what binds us together. Those are our commonalities. And so the languages, for example, as of recent, we see Univision News and Telemundo News, and all of them in English. We didn't see that, you know, a decade ago. And it's just the reality that we grow, that the nation grows with the immigrants that come in, with us that come in, and we grow and we make it better. And I think that that's the main point. When we're talking about assimilation, we're talking about assimilation to a greater place.
Ahilan, what are your thoughts? You know, as someone who has parents from Sri Lanka, you know, did you experience any growing pains when it came to assimilation?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's part of the immigrant and first generation experience, and I think it is important to tell these stories because it humanizes it, and it does show how much. I mean, for my parents, I think. They also wanted me to learn Tamil, you know, which is the language from northeast Sri Lanka, which is where my family is from. But at the same time, they also wanted me to be able to speak like, you know, any American, whatever that meant. And I think now, when we look back on it, I think I sort of agree with what Santiago was saying in the video. It's a non-issue over time, right? I mean, of course, the country grew pizza. Think about pizza, right? I mean, pizza is American, sure, but pizza is immigrant food, right? But what does that mean 100 years later? Yeah. You know, and that's the America that's going to come in the future as a result of all the immigrants who get integrated into this country. And for people to worry about that and have fear that it's somehow changing, it's like, we're always changing. We're a nation of immigrants. That's who we are. And so I feel that's something that we should embrace rather than try to, you know, have any kind of fear of.
Did you guys ever experience bringing, you know, your cultural food, for instance, to school and feeling a little awkward about that, feeling like you should be eating the frozen pizza that everyone else is eating, and you're, like, for me, I had like dolma, sadma, lavmajun, like all of this Armenian food that was like a little stinky and a little, you know what I mean? And it's like, oh, what is everyone, you know, thinking? I felt so awkward about it, but now I own it. I'm like, I love my stinky food, it's delicious.
Yeah, well, I always brought lime and hot sauce, and I put that on everything, kind of like that at the end. I have my packages and put it on, even potato chips, and people are looking at me, what are you doing with that? And I think, you know, but then they try it, and it's like, oh, you know, that's not bad. And so some of my friends are even like putting hot sauce and everything. And
I mean, that says a lot about like Doritos. I'm sorry, Doritos now have, you know, the tapatio.
I know.
So hello.
And for me, when I was in college, first 3 years I ate the cafeteria food. Senior year, I was done, and I was, you know, hell-bent to learn to cook rice and curry. My roommates, you know, learned along with me. There's this like guy from New Mexico, this other guy from Mobile, Alabama, eating like, you know, fish curry and like rice, and to me, like, that was so great, you know, and now I look back, they're like, you know, 20 years later, they're like talking about, oh yeah, that fish curry was so good.
Yeah,
you know?
God, I could talk about food forever. But anyway, let's move on to something else. I want to talk about accents because, you know, obviously, there are some individuals that, employers for instance, that might discriminate against possible employees if they have a thick accent. And so what would you tell an immigrant who is assimilating into US culture but still holding on to his or her culture? Do you think that these people should go out and learn to get rid of their accent, or should they own it? What do you think, Axel?
Well, I think it's a skill. right? Like every language. So when we were talking about keeping the language, your mother tongue per se language, and your family's language, it really is an additional skill. It's to be competitive in the world, and that's really how it needs to be considered. If you want to get better, to get better skills, you just get additional languages or perfect the language that you have. But it's not something that it's ingrained or pushed onto someone, but someone inherently pushes to improve that skill per se.
Yeah, I always think about this story that our executive producer, actually I don't know if he's the executive producer anymore, but Steve-O, he said that someone had told him, he came here from South Korea, and someone had told him, like, wow, you don't have an Asian accent at all. Like, they were amazed by it. And it's incredible that people pay such close attention to that when it comes to immigrants, Now, let's talk about discrimination a little bit before we conclude the show. Now, all of us are obviously from different backgrounds. Have any of you experienced any type of discrimination because of your heritage? Wendy, let's start with you.
Maybe when I was younger, you'd go into the stores and you always feel like there's somebody, looking at you, wondering what you're doing there. But I think a lot of it is just you're conscious of yourself because there's all this negativity around who you are and what you look like. My male friends, for example, they'll say, driving while Latino, driving while black, or like because they're men and they're men of color. Like there's all kinds of situations that they experience that maybe I, as a female, don't. So I think that those are considerations, and I don't know. I feel like I don't quite pay attention to it anymore. Maybe because I'm in a different environment, and I think when your environment changes, you change as well.
Yeah.
And so you begin to see the world through a very different lens.
Also, we do live in a little bit of a bubble because we're in Los Angeles, which is pretty liberal, and we have people from all different backgrounds here. But still, I think that you still come across instances where people are like, "That's weird. What's going on?"
Yeah, for me it was tricky because the stereotypes are so strong in some communities that that when I say, well, I'm from Mexico, people say, well, you don't look Mexican. Like there's an idea of what that looks like that is really a misconception. And a funny story is when I used to work through college, I worked in restaurants, in the kitchen and also as a server. And a lot of people wouldn't know that I speak, Spanish fluently, and they would talk behind my back in Spanish. And I'm like, wait a second.
Well, what would they say? Was it usually negative stuff?
Yeah, because either the cooks against the servers or vice versa and stuff. And I'm like, but I can understand what you're talking
That's
about.
hilarious.
So, it's this cultural kind of thing that we find interesting, and really it's not a perfect commonality. It's really not a perfect, and that's what makes it great.
All right, Ahilan, you get the last word on the segment.
Well, I've been mistaken for my clients in many situations.
Wow.
And both in pure immigration cases and in national security cases involving immigration. And my feeling in those situations is always just to challenge the stereotype in a kind of polite but kind of firm way, and just recognize it for what it is. And I think that could be said about the whole immigration debate. There's all this insecurity that if we get rid of, we would recognize that we should be welcoming to the people who are our own. It's what our country is, and we should be welcoming to immigrants as a whole.
All right. Well, I enjoyed this conversation. I hope our audience did as well. As always, please share your thoughts. We love to read your comments, and obviously, we love to use your constructive criticism. And I want to thank our panelists. Ahilan, thank you so much for joining us. You're with the ACLU. Tell our audience where they can find more about you.
At www.aclu.org. And we have a huge amount of information on all of the work that we're doing on immigrants' rights more generally. So thank you very much for having me.
No problem. It was a pleasure having you. And Axel, you do great work with Brave New Films. Tell the audience a little more about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. So our main site is mycuentame.org. We have a campaign that we just launched today, actually, a series. It's a documentary series, and it's called If You Don't, They Will. And we went and interviewed the Minutemen and CAPS and CCIR, which are organizations, anti-immigrant organizations, as well as some neo-Nazis in Arizona. And we confronted them in person to get that perspective also. And so if you want to check what they had to say, check it out. It's at ifyoudon'ttheywill.com.
All right, excellent. And Wendy Carrillo, thank you so much for coming on the show. Tell our audience audience more about yourself.
Thank you. Well, I am single, bilingual, ready to mingle.
Oh, damn. Get it, girl.
Well, you can catch a podcast of my show on my website at wendycarrillo.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Wendy Carrillo, and I was not kidding about that first part.
All right, excellent. And of course, special thanks to our point contributors, Immortal Technique, Ben Powell, and Bill Santiago. I'm Anna Kasparian, the host of this show, and you guys can obviously check me out Monday through Friday on The Young Turks at youtube.com/TYT Live. We'll see you next week.